The first thing I noticed was the empty space on the shelf, not the missing books themselves. The space. My daughter had arranged them with obsessive care, every spine aligned, every cover protected, every title recorded in a small notebook she kept beside the window. Now there was a clean, rectangular absence where they had been. When I asked my mother about it, she did not look surprised. She only said very calmly that the room looked less cluttered. My father agreed without even turning his head. They spoke as if nothing important had changed. But my daughter stood in the doorway behind them, silent, staring at the shelf like someone trying to remember a face that had already been erased. And in that moment, I realized something simple. They were lying, not nervously, not carelessly, quietly, completely, and they believed I would accept it. For most of my life, my parents were the people I trusted without thinking, not because they demanded it, not because they asked for it. Trust simply existed around them the way air does in a room, invisible, constant, unquestioned. They lived 10 minutes from my house in the same neighborhood where I grew up, the same streets, the same grocery store on the corner, the same sidewalks my daughter later learned to ride her bicycle on. After my wife passed away, their presence felt like stability, something predictable, something steady. My daughter and I moved into the house 3 years later. It was smaller than the one we had before, but quieter. The rooms held sound in a softer way. In the afternoons, sunlight fell through the living room windows and reached the far wall where my daughter kept her shelves. That wall became her world. The shelves were not expensive, plain wood, slightly uneven if you looked closely, but she treated them with a kind of seriousness that made the entire room feel different. Each book had a place. Each space had a reason. She started collecting them when she was 9. At first, it was small things, old paperbacks from library sales, forgotten volumes from used bookstores where the air smelled like dust and slow time. She was patient with it, more patient than most adults I knew. If she found a book she liked, she did not rush to buy it. She researched it first. She wrote titles down in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She learned about first editions, limited printings, publisher marks hidden on the inside pages. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sit on the floor near the shelves and gently wipe the covers with a soft cloth. Not because they were dirty, because she liked the ritual of caring for them. I never told her how unusual that seemed. Children usually collect things loudly. Toys, cards, objects that fill rooms quickly and disappear just as quickly. But books moved slowly, one at a time, month after month, year after year. My parents noticed the shelves early. My mother was the first to comment on them. One afternoon, she stood in the doorway of the living room, studying the wall while my daughter arranged a new arrival she had found at a market downtown. "That is a lot of old paper," she said. Her voice was neutral, not critical, not approving, just observational. My daughter looked up from the shelf. "They are not just old paper," she said quietly. "Some of them are hard to find." My mother smiled the way adults sometimes do when children say something they consider slightly exaggerated. "I am sure they are," she replied. My father approached the shelves more directly. He had always liked objects that lasted. Tools, watches, mechanical things that required maintenance and patience. He picked up one of the books carefully, turning it in his hands. "How old is this one?" he asked. 1942, my daughter said. She did not take it back immediately. She waited until he finished looking at it. That detail stayed with me. She trusted him enough to let him hold it. Over the next few years, the collection grew in quiet increments. Birthdays, weekend trips, occasional discoveries at estate sales where the owners had passed away and their libraries were being quietly dismantled. Sometimes my parents came with us. My father enjoyed the searching. He would scan tables quickly, the way someone looks for a tool in a crowded workshop. Every now and then he would call my daughter over. "What about this one?" She would take the book, open the cover, check the publisher page, and think about it for a moment. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she placed it back. Those small decisions seemed to impress him. "You have patience," he told her once. She simply shrugged. To her, patience was normal. The shelves eventually filled the entire wall. 3 long rows of carefully spaced volumes. No decorations, no toys, just books. My mother occasionally suggested we move some of them to storage. "Too much sunlight will fade the covers," she said once. My daughter adjusted the curtains that same evening. Problems solved. Nothing about those years felt fragile. My parents visited often. Sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen and talk about ordinary things. They brought groceries occasionally. Fixed small problems around the house. Replaced a leaking faucet one winter afternoon. My daughter trusted them. She spoke freely around them. And when she showed them a new addition to her shelves, she did it with the quiet pride of someone sharing something important. Looking back now, I realize something strange. The shelves were always in the center of the room. Anyone who entered the house saw them immediately. But none of us ever imagined they were something that could disappear. They felt permanent, like furniture, like walls, like family. And for a long time, I believed that permanence included my parents. Nothing in those early years suggested otherwise. Nothing in their voices, nothing in their expressions, nothing in the way they stood near the shelves, occasionally picking up a book and turning it carefully in their hands. At the time, it all felt ordinary, simple, safe, but trust has a strange quality. You do not notice its weight while you are carrying it. You only understand it after someone quietly removes it from the room and leaves the space behind. The comments started slowly. At first, they felt harmless. The kind of remarks older people make when they do not quite understand a younger person's interests. My mother usually said them while standing near the shelves, brushing invisible dust from the edge of a table or straightening something that did not need straightening. "So many books," she said one afternoon. It was not a complaint. It sounded more like mild curiosity. My daughter was sitting on the floor with her notebook open beside her. She was updating the catalog she kept for the collection. Every book had an entry, title, author, year, condition, and where she found it. She wrote slowly, carefully. Without looking up, she answered, "There are 74. My mother paused. 74. My daughter nodded and turned a page in the notebook. My mother gave a small laugh. "I do not think I have owned 74 books in my entire life." My daughter smiled politely. The conversation ended there. But after that day, the shelves seemed to attract attention in a different way. My parents noticed them more often. My father began asking small questions, not complicated ones, just details. "How much did that one cost? Where did you find this edition? Is this one older than the others?" At first, the questions felt encouraging. My daughter liked explaining the history behind certain volumes. She spoke softly but confidently when the subject was books. She showed him how to recognize a first printing. She explained the difference between a reissue and an original edition. She pointed out tiny symbols on the copyright pages that most people would never notice. My father listened with genuine interest, but sometimes his questions shifted slightly. "How do you know if a book is valuable?" My daughter shrugged. "Some collectors want specific editions, and they pay money for them." "Yes. How much money?" She thought for a moment. "Sometimes a lot." My father nodded slowly, not surprised, just thoughtful. The first moment that felt slightly uncomfortable happened during a Sunday dinner. The 4 of us were sitting around the kitchen table. My daughter had just returned from a used bookstore downtown with a small paper bag containing 2 new editions. She placed them on the table carefully, the way someone might place fragile glass. My mother glanced at the bag. "More books?" she asked. "Yes." My daughter slid them out of the bag and turned them so the covers faced us. My father picked one up. It was older than most of the others. The cover was faded, but the binding was intact. "How much did this cost?" he asked. My daughter hesitated for the first time. $70. My mother raised her eyebrows. "For an old book." The tone was not hostile, but something in the room shifted slightly. My daughter lowered her eyes to the table. "It is a first edition." My mother leaned back in her chair. "I suppose people spend money on all kinds of things." The conversation moved on to other topics, but that small moment stayed in the air longer than it should have. After dinner, I found my daughter back in the living room placing the new books on the shelves. She was more careful than usual, adjusting the spacing between volumes, making sure every spine aligned perfectly. "Did Grandma upset you?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." But she spoke more quietly than before. A few weeks later, my father visited the house while I was at work. When I returned home that evening, he was standing near the shelves with his phone in his hand. My daughter sat nearby reading. "What are you doing?" I asked. He held up the phone casually. "Just taking a picture." "Of the books." "An old friend of mine likes antiques," he said. "I told him my granddaughter collects interesting things." He took another photo before lowering the phone. The moment passed quickly, but my daughter watched him with a new kind of attention, not suspicion, just awareness. After he left that evening, she walked over to the shelves and checked a few titles, not because anything was missing, simply to reassure herself they were still there. I noticed the habit growing after that. Every few days, she would run her fingers along the spines, counting quietly under her breath. Sometimes she compared them to the list in her notebook. 76, she would whisper, or 77. The numbers mattered to her, the exact count, the exact order. At the time, I assumed it was part of her personality, the carefulness, the structure. Children often create systems to make sense of things they love, but looking back now, I realize something subtle had already begun. The books were no longer just a collection. They had become something my daughter felt she needed to protect. And my parents, without realizing it, or perhaps without caring, had started looking at them in a different way. Not as objects of interest, but as objects with a price. The difference between those two perspectives is small at first, almost invisible, until the day something disappears, and no one seems surprised. The first book did not disappear in a dramatic way. There was no broken lock, no open window, no sign that anyone had taken something that did not belong to them. There was simply an absence. My daughter noticed it on a Wednesday evening. She had finished her homework and was standing near the shelves with her notebook open, doing the quiet inventory she sometimes performed when the house was calm. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard her counting softly. 78, 79, 80, then silence. A long pause. I dried my hands and walked into the living room. She was staring at the middle shelf. Her finger hovered over a small, empty space between two books. "It was here," she said quietly. "What was?" She flipped through her notebook and pointed to an entry. "Alice in Wonderland, the older one." I looked at the shelves. The gap was small. If someone did not know the collection, they might not notice it, but my daughter noticed everything. "Maybe you moved it," I said gently. She shook her head. "I do not move them without writing it down." "Did you lend it to someone?" "No." Her voice remained calm, but her shoulders had tightened slightly. "We searched the house anyway. The desk drawers, the coffee table, her bedroom. Sometimes books drift into unexpected places, but we did not find it. After a while, I assumed the explanation would appear later. Objects often reappear when people stop looking for them, But my daughter returned to the shelf and continued staring at the empty space. She placed her notebook on the floor and sat beside it. For several minutes she did not speak, then she slowly wrote something next to the entry. Missing. That word looked strangely heavy on the page. The next time my parents visited, my daughter mentioned it casually. Grandma, did you see my Alice book last time you were here? My mother was pouring tea at the kitchen counter. She paused briefly before answering. I do not think so. It was on the middle shelf. I rarely look at the shelves, my mother replied. There are too many books for me to keep track of. The answer sounded reasonable. My daughter nodded. Then she asked my father, Did you move it when you took pictures? He frowned slightly as if the idea surprised him. Of course not, he said. I would not touch something without asking. The response seemed firm enough to end the conversation, but something about the timing felt strange. Because a few days later, another small inconsistency appeared. This time the book was still there. But it was not where my daughter had left it. She noticed it immediately. That one was on the top shelf, she said. I looked where she was pointing. A green-covered volume sat between two titles that normally belonged together. Maybe it slipped, I suggested. She shook her head again. They do not slip. Her certainty made me examine the shelf more closely. The books were tightly arranged. There was no empty space where the green volume might have fallen from. Someone had moved it. Did Grandma move them when she visited yesterday? She asked. I do not know, I said. Later that evening, I called my mother. Did you rearrange the books a little when you stopped by yesterday? She sounded puzzled. Why would I do that? Just wondering. No, she said. I barely went into the living room. The conversation ended quickly. I tried not to think too much about it. Small household mysteries happen all the time. But a few weeks later, I came home early from work. My father's car was parked outside the house. That was not unusual. My parents visited often. When I walked inside, I heard the faint sound of movement in the living room. My father stood near the shelves with his phone raised. He did not notice me at first. He was focused on the screen, taking pictures, several pictures from different angles. When he saw me, he lowered the phone immediately. Oh, he said, you are home early. I nodded. What are you doing? He gestured toward the shelves. Still sending pictures to that friend I told you about. The antique collector. Yes. He placed the phone in his pocket. Your daughter has interesting taste. His tone was relaxed, almost casual, but my eyes drifted toward the shelves behind him. A few books were slightly out of line, not dramatically, just enough to suggest they had been handled. My father noticed me looking. He stepped aside and straightened one of them carefully. Collectors like seeing the condition of things, he said. Spines. Covers, details. I nodded slowly. The explanation sounded logical, but something in my chest felt unsettled. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet awareness that the room had begun changing in ways I did not fully understand. My daughter entered the living room a moment later. Her eyes went immediately to the shelves. She did not say anything, but she walked closer and began scanning the rows, one by one, the way someone counts something valuable without speaking. My father watched her for a moment. Then he turned toward the kitchen. Children become protective of strange things, he said. I did not answer, because as I stood there looking at the shelves, I realized something for the first time. The books were no longer simply objects in our home. They had become something people were measuring, observing, recording. And whatever my father was sending to his friend, he seemed very interested in making sure the pictures were clear, precise, detailed. Almost as if someone far away needed to see exactly what was sitting on those shelves and decide what it was worth. The second book disappeared 2 weeks later. This time my daughter did not say anything immediately. I noticed her standing in front of the shelves one evening after dinner, her notebook closed in her hands. She stared at the rows the way someone studies a puzzle that no longer fits together the way it used to. "Something wrong?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she opened the notebook and showed me the page. 2 entries now had the same word written beside them: missing. The new one was a small red volume from the late 1930s. She had found it at a quiet estate sale nearly a year earlier and spent 2 weeks researching its printing history before deciding to buy it. "You are sure?" I asked gently. She nodded. "I counted 3 times." Her voice did not tremble. That worried me more than if she had cried. The room felt strangely quiet. The shelves still looked full to someone who did not know them. But once you understood the system, the gaps became obvious. Small wounds in the order she had built. My parents came over that weekend. I waited until my daughter stepped outside to ride her bicycle before mentioning it. "Another book is missing," I said. My mother looked confused. "What do you mean missing?" "Gone." She frowned slightly, as if trying to understand why the word mattered. "Are you sure she did not move it?" "She keeps records of everything." My father leaned back in his chair. "Children forget things," he said calmly. "She is not the only person who lives in this house." The sentence landed heavier than it sounded. "You think I moved them?" I asked. "I did not say that," he replied. My mother stirred her tea slowly. "You might be overthinking this," she added. "Sometimes children misplace things and then convince themselves they did not." The explanation sounded simple, comfortable. But something in the way they delivered it felt rehearsed. Later that evening, my daughter returned inside and noticed them sitting in the living room. She walked toward the shelves automatically. Her eyes moved along the rows, then she looked at my parents. "Did either of you take one of the books?" she asked. The question was direct but quiet. My mother laughed softly. "Why would we take your books?" "Maybe to read them," my daughter said. My father shook his head. "I have plenty of books at home." He spoke without irritation, almost amused. My daughter studied their faces for a moment longer than usual, then she nodded. "Okay." She returned to her notebook and wrote something again. I could not see the page from where I stood, but I knew she was updating the list. Over the next month, the pattern continued, not quickly, slowly. Another book disappeared, then another. Sometimes weeks passed between them. Sometimes the spacing changed. But the direction remained the same. The shelves were shrinking. My daughter began checking them every evening. She counted in whispers now, her finger moving carefully along each spine. When the number changed, she did not react loudly. She simply wrote another word beside another title, missing. The notebook began to look different, more blank spaces, more quiet confirmations that something had left the room. When I mentioned the pattern again to my parents, the reaction changed slightly. My father sighed. "You are letting this become a problem when it is not one." "It is not a problem if books disappear from the house," I asked. "They are books," he said, "old paper." My mother nodded gently. "Your daughter might be focusing on them too much," she added. "Children sometimes become obsessed with hobbies." "She is not obsessed," I replied. "She is organized." My father shrugged. "Either way, you are giving the situation too much importance." That phrase stayed with me. Too much importance. Later that night, my daughter sat beside the shelves again. She did not count immediately. Instead, she looked at the notebook resting on her knees. "Dad," she said quietly. "Yes. What if someone thinks the books do not matter?" I thought carefully before answering. "They matter to you," I said. She nodded. "But what if someone else decides they do not?" Her voice remained calm, almost analytical. I realized then that she was not asking about books. She was asking about something deeper, about the strange shift happening in the room, about the feeling that adults were pretending not to see something obvious. I sat beside her on the floor. "No one gets to decide what matters to you," I said. She considered that for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and placed it beside her. "Okay," she said softly. But the next evening I noticed something new. She had moved a chair near the shelves, not to read, not to clean them, just to sit, and watch the room, not in fear, not even in anger, just quiet observation. The kind of patience collectors learn over time. Because when something valuable begins disappearing slowly, the first instinct is not always confrontation. Sometimes it is simply waiting and seeing who reaches for the shelf next. By the middle of that winter, the shelves no longer looked the same. To anyone visiting casually, they still appeared full. Rows of worn bindings, quiet colors, old paper aging slowly in the afternoon light. But my daughter could see the difference immediately. She did not need to count anymore. Her eyes moved along the rows the way someone reads a familiar sentence and instantly notices when a word has been removed. 10 books were gone. 10 small absences spaced across the shelves like careful erasures. She had stopped asking my parents about them. That silence felt heavier than the earlier questions. Instead of confronting anyone, she spent more time writing in her notebook. Sometimes she researched titles on her computer late at night. I could hear the soft tapping of keys from the hallway long after the house should have been quiet. One evening, she walked into the kitchen holding her laptop. "Dad," she said, placing it gently on the table. "Look at this." The screen showed a listing on an auction website, a photograph of a book, not just any book, one of hers. I recognized the faint crease on the corner of the cover immediately. She had pointed it out to me months earlier when she bought it. She had even written a note about that crease in her catalog, proof of condition. The listing described the book in careful detail: first edition, original binding, excellent condition. There was also a starting price, $8,000. I sat down slowly. "Are you sure this is the same one?" I asked. She nodded. "Look at the mark on the spine." There it was, a tiny faded line that ran across the cloth binding, the same one. There was no doubt. "Who is selling it?" I asked. She scrolled down the page. A seller name appeared, not a person. A small consignment shop located about 20 minutes from our house. My daughter looked at me quietly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, then she closed the laptop. "Can we go there tomorrow?" she asked. The next morning, we drove to the address listed on the website. The shop sat on a quiet street between a hardware store and a dry cleaner. The windows were filled with objects that seemed to belong to other decades: old clocks, porcelain figurines, antique lamps. Inside, the air smelled like wood polish and aging paper. A man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. When we entered, he looked up politely. "Can I help you?" My daughter stepped forward first. She opened her notebook and turned to a page where she had copied the auction listing. "This book," she said softly. The man glanced at the page. "Yes, you are selling it online. That is correct." "Who brought it to you?" The question surprised him. "Why do you ask?" "It belonged to me," she said. The man studied her face for a moment. Then he looked at me. I could see the calculation happening in his expression. Not suspicion, just quiet evaluation. "Books like that usually come from estates," he said carefully, "or private collectors." "Did someone sell you several of them?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he walked to a computer behind the counter and typed something. After a moment, he turned the screen slightly so we could see. A list appeared. Item numbers, descriptions, sale prices. I recognized several titles instantly. They were all from the shelves in our living room. The total at the bottom of the page caught my attention. $165,000. The man folded his hands together. "An older couple brought them in over the past few months," he said. "Very polite, very organized." My daughter did not move. "Do you remember their names?" I asked. He shook his head. "Consignment clients often prefer privacy." "But you remember them." He nodded slowly. "They came together most of the time." "Did they say where the books came from?" "Yes, and," he paused, then he answered, They said the books were part of a family collection that was no longer being used. The sentence sat in the air between us. My daughter looked down at her notebook. Her fingers rested lightly on the page where she had written the word missing 10 separate times. The shop owner cleared his throat. "If there is a dispute about ownership," he said carefully, "there are legal procedures." I nodded, but I was not thinking about procedures. I was thinking about my parents standing in our living room, looking at the shelves, taking pictures, asking quiet questions about value, and slowly removing pieces of my daughter's world while calmly telling us we were imagining the problem. My daughter closed the notebook. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. "Did they bring more books last week?" The man looked at the computer again. "Yes. How many?" "3, she nodded once. Then she turned toward the door. "Thank you," she said politely. We walked back to the car without speaking. Halfway home, my daughter finally asked the question both of us already knew the answer to. "Why would they do that?" I did not answer immediately. Because some truths arrive quietly, not with shouting, not with anger, just the slow realization that the people you trusted most have been standing in the room the entire time, carefully removing what never belonged to them, and selling it piece by piece, while calmly explaining that nothing was missing at all. When we returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. Nothing had physically changed. The same quiet rooms, the same sunlight drifting across the living room floor. But once a hidden pattern becomes visible, it is impossible to unsee it. My daughter walked directly to the shelves. She did not rush. She moved with the calm focus she always used when handling the books. Her fingers touched the spines one by one. Then she stepped back. 72, she said quietly. The number should have been 82. 10 were already gone. 3 more had been sold last week. I could see her doing the calculation without speaking. She opened her notebook and added another page. On the top, she wrote a new heading. Confirmed sales underneath it. She began listing the titles we had seen on the computer screen at the consignment shop, each one carefully recorded. Each one crossed from the original catalog. When she finished writing, she closed the notebook. "Are you going to talk to them?" she asked. "Yes. Tonight?" "Yes." She nodded once and placed the notebook beside the shelves. Then she went upstairs to her room. When my parents arrived that evening, everything felt almost normal. My mother carried a small bag of groceries. My father walked in behind her, brushing cold air from his jacket. "Good evening," my mother said. She moved toward the kitchen automatically. "Dinner smells good." I did not answer. Instead, I remained standing in the living room. My father noticed first. "Something wrong?" he asked. I gestured toward the couch. "Can we sit for a minute?" They exchanged a brief glance. Then both sat down. I stayed standing. It was not intentional. It simply felt easier to remain on my feet. "I went to a consignment shop today," I said. My father's expression did not change. "What for?" "They are selling several rare books." My mother folded her hands in her lap. "That sounds interesting." $165,000 worth, I continued. Silence filled the room, not a shocked silence, a waiting silence. My father leaned back slightly. "And the books came from here." I watched their faces carefully. There was no sudden panic, no defensive anger, just a slow shift in posture. The kind people make when a conversation finally reaches the subject everyone already understands. My mother spoke first. "Well," she said softly, "that explains a few things." "What things?" I asked. "The empty spaces on the shelves." Her calmness felt almost surreal. "You knew they were missing." She shrugged gently. "We noticed a few had disappeared." "And you did not think to mention that?" My father spoke this time. "You were already worried about it." "We did not want to make the situation worse." I looked at him carefully. "Did you sell them?" Another pause, not denial, just consideration. Then he nodded once. Yes. The word landed quietly. No apology followed it. My mother leaned forward slightly. You have to understand something, she said. Those books were sitting here unused. They were not unused, I replied. They were part of her collection. My father exhaled slowly. She is a child. She is a collector. She is 10 years old. The sentence carried a subtle finality, as if that fact alone should resolve the entire issue. You sold them without asking, I said. They were in this house, my father replied. This house belongs to you, I said, and the books belong to her. He tilted his head slightly. Legally, the question felt deliberate, carefully chosen. They were purchased with her money, I said. Birthday gifts, savings, allowance. My mother sighed. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be. $165,000 is complicated, I said. That money was not the point, my father replied calmly. Then what was? He gestured toward the shelves. Assets. The word hung in the air. My mother nodded gently. They had value, she said, and they were sitting here doing nothing. They were not yours to sell. My father's eyes moved toward the staircase for a moment. Does she know? Yes. Another quiet pause. My mother looked genuinely uncomfortable now. That might have been a mistake. What do you mean? She is young, my mother said. Children become emotional about objects. These were not just objects. My father stood up slowly. Listen, he said, his voice still calm. We did something practical. We converted idle items into usable money. For who? I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. My father walked toward the shelves and studied them the way he had many times before. He reached out and touched one of the remaining books. You still have plenty left, he said. The sentence echoed strangely in the room. From the top of the staircase, a soft sound broke the silence. My daughter was standing there. She had been listening. Her eyes moved from the shelves to my parents, then back to the shelves again. She did not speak. She simply looked at the empty spaces, and in that quiet moment, the reality of what had happened settled into the room completely. Not as an argument, not as a dramatic revelation, just the calm understanding that the people who were supposed to protect something valuable had been quietly dismantling it, one piece at a time, and they still believed they had done nothing wrong. My daughter did not cry. That was the first thing I noticed after she walked down the stairs. Most children would have reacted differently. Anger, confusion, tears, something loud enough to match the size of what had just been taken from them. But she remained quiet. She stepped into the living room and walked past my parents without looking directly at them. Her attention went to the shelves. The empty spaces had been there for weeks, but now they seemed heavier, more permanent. She studied them slowly. Then she reached for the notebook resting beside the chair she had placed there earlier in the month. She opened it to the newest page, the one labeled Confirmed Sales. My parents watched her in silence. My mother shifted slightly in her seat. You do not need to worry about those books, she said gently. My daughter did not respond. She simply added another line to the list, another title, another confirmation. My father folded his arms. This is exactly what I meant, he said quietly. She is becoming too attached to things. My daughter closed the notebook. Then she looked at him. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. They were not just things. My father gave a small shrug. That depends on how you look at them. She held his gaze for a moment, not with anger, just careful attention. Then she turned to me. Dad, she said softly. Yes. Can we keep the shelves? The question surprised me. Yes, I said. Of course. She nodded once. Okay. Then she carried the notebook upstairs and disappeared into her room. My mother watched the staircase for a moment. I told you, she said to me quietly. She is emotional about it. I did not answer, because something else had already begun forming in my mind. Not a confrontation, not revenge, just a shift in how I understood the situation. My parents had not acted impulsively. They had acted methodically. They had asked questions about value, taken photographs, visited the consignment shop multiple times, removed books slowly so the pattern would not be obvious, and every time the subject came up they dismissed it, minimized it, turned the concern back toward us, overreacting, paranoia, children misplacing things. The structure of the deception was clear now, which meant the response could not be emotional, it had to be precise. Later that night, after my parents left, I sat at the kitchen table with my daughter's notebook. She had left it open on purpose. Every title was listed carefully: dates of purchase, prices she paid, locations where she found them, small notes about condition. Some entries even included photographs she had printed and attached to the pages. It was more than a list, it was documentation. I turned to the page marked confirmed sales. She had already written down everything we saw at the shop: item numbers, auction listings, sale prices, total value, $165,000. The number looked unreal on paper, but the system behind it was very real. Consignment records, transaction receipts, online listings, shipping documentation. Every book had passed through a chain of witnesses and systems, which meant every book had a trace. The next morning, I made several phone calls, first to the consignment shop, then to an attorney who specialized in property disputes, then to the online auction platform itself. I did not accuse anyone directly. I simply asked questions. What documentation existed for each sale? What identification had been provided by the sellers? What agreements had been signed during the consignment process? The answers arrived slowly throughout the week. Every transaction left a record: driver's licenses, signatures, payment accounts, deposit receipts. The system was quiet but thorough. By the time Friday arrived, I had a folder filled with copies of documents, each one confirming the same simple fact. The books had been sold by my parents, not anonymously, not indirectly, directly, with their names attached. When I returned home that evening, my daughter was sitting near the shelves again, not counting this time, just reading one of the books that remained. I sat beside her on the floor. "Do you remember the first book you ever bought?" I asked. She nodded. "The blue one. The one from the library sale." "Yes. Why did you buy it?" She thought for a moment. "Because it felt important, even though it was only $3. Yes." I looked at the shelves again. The empty spaces had not changed, but my understanding of them had. "They sold something important," I said quietly. She closed the book. "I know, but the story is not finished yet." She looked at me carefully. "What do you mean?" I reached for the notebook and turned to the page where she had written confirmed sales. Then I placed the folder of documents beside it. "This," I said softly, "is what happens when someone forgets that collections are also records." She studied the papers slowly. Her eyes moved across the signatures, the dates, the transaction numbers. When she finished reading, she closed the folder gently. Then she placed it beside her notebook. "Okay," she said. No excitement, no relief. Just quiet understanding. Because sometimes the breaking point does not arrive as anger. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. The moment when the truth stops being emotional and becomes simply something that needs to be documented. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later. It came in a plain envelope from the attorney's office. Not dramatic, not threatening, just several pages explaining the situation in careful language. Ownership documentation, unauthorized sale of property, financial recovery procedures, possible legal remedies. I read it slowly at the kitchen table while my daughter worked on homework across the room. She did not ask what the letter said. She already understood. The next step was simple. The consignment shop received a formal notice identifying the books as property sold without the owner's authorization. The auction platform received the same documentation. Transaction records were requested. Payment trails were reviewed. Everything moved through systems that had no emotional attachment to any of us. They only recognized documentation, signatures, evidence. 3 days later, the consignment shop owner called. His voice sounded careful. "I received the legal notice," he said. "Yes, I did not know the books belonged to your daughter." "I understand." He paused before continuing. "We still have 2 of the titles that have not shipped yet. Can they be returned?" "Yes." "Good." Another pause. "The others were already delivered to buyers," he said. "Some of them overseas." "I expected that. What happens now?" "The attorney will contact them," I said. "Through the platform. Most collectors cooperate when ownership is disputed." He exhaled quietly. "I wish I had known earlier." "So do I," the call ended politely. No anger, just the slow mechanics of a system correcting something it had been given incorrect information about. My parents received their letter a few days after that. I was not there when it arrived, but my mother called me that evening. Her voice was tight. "You contacted a lawyer." "Yes, you are making this into a legal issue. It already was one. We are your parents. I know. You should have talked to us first." "I did." Silence filled the line for several seconds. "You are going to embarrass us," she said finally. "That is not my intention." My father took the phone next. His voice sounded colder. "You are escalating something that could have been resolved privately." "You sold 10 books privately," I said. "They were part of the household." "They were not. We disagreed about that. The documentation does not." Another long pause. "You are choosing property over family," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "You made that choice when you sold her collection." He did not answer. The call ended shortly after that. Over the following weeks, the consequences unfolded quietly. 2 books were returned immediately from the consignment shop. They arrived in protective packaging, wrapped carefully in layers of paper. My daughter opened the box at the kitchen table. She lifted each book slowly, examining the covers, checking the spines, making sure nothing had changed. Then she carried them back to the shelves. She did not celebrate. She simply restored them to their original positions. 8 books remained missing, but the recovery process continued. The auction platform froze several payments that had not yet cleared. Some buyers agreed to return the books after receiving documentation. Others required negotiations. The process was slow, months instead of days. During that time, my parents stopped visiting the house. At first, they sent messages asking to talk. Then the messages became shorter. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Word spread quietly through the extended family, not the dramatic version, just fragments. A disagreement about books. A legal misunderstanding. Something uncomfortable people preferred not to discuss in detail. But systems do not rely on conversations. They rely on records. And the records were clear. Driver's license copies from the consignment agreements. Bank deposits connected to each sale. Digital listings archived by the auction platform. Every transaction confirmed the same story. My parents had sold something that did not belong to them. One evening, several months later, another package arrived. Then another. 3 more books slowly returned home, each one carefully logged back into my daughter's notebook, each one placed exactly where it had been before. The shelves began to look familiar again, not complete, but closer. And through it all, my daughter remained quiet. She never spoke badly about my parents. She never asked when they might visit again. She simply continued reading and slowly rebuilding what had been taken, one book at a time, because consequences do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive through paperwork, through signatures, through the quiet understanding that systems remember things people wish would disappear. And once the truth is written into those systems, it becomes very difficult to erase. The shelves are not full anymore. Even now, months later, there are still small spaces where certain books used to sit. If someone unfamiliar with the room walked in, they probably would not notice them. But my daughter notices every one. She always will. 7 of the missing books eventually returned. Some arrived through the auction platform. Others came back quietly from collectors who read the documentation and decided the situation was not worth keeping the books. 3 never came home. They exist somewhere else now, on other shelves, in other rooms, owned by people who likely do not know the story behind them. My daughter still keeps their entries in the notebook. She never erased them. Next to each title, she wrote a different word: unrecovered. My parents have not been inside the house since that winter. We speak occasionally on the phone. The conversations are polite, careful, short. They never mention the books directly. Instead, we talk about weather, family updates, ordinary things that fill the space where trust used to exist. No one apologizes. No one demands forgiveness. The subject simply sits between us, quiet and permanent. My daughter does not ask about them anymore. She does something else instead. Every few weeks, we visit the same used bookstores and estate sales we used to explore together. The process has started again. Slowly, patiently. Last month, she found a replacement for one of the titles that never returned. Not the same printing, not the same year, but close. When she placed it on the shelf, she adjusted the surrounding books carefully until the spacing looked right. Then she stepped back and studied the wall. For a moment, the room felt almost like it used to. Not identical. Just familiar enough. Later that evening, I asked her if she was happy to have the shelf looking fuller again. She thought about the question for a long time before answering. "It is not the same collection," she said quietly. "No. But it is still mine," I nodded. And as the light faded across the shelves, I realized something simple. Books can be replaced. Collections can be rebuilt. But trust, once sold, does not return through the mail. It remains exactly where it was left. In the empty space on the shelf.